Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we're going to continue, inshallah, what we were talking about last time. And today we just have a couple of slides to go, so hopefully we can finish them today. And today we're actually discussing the issue of women's education and women scholars. We did discuss last time, and we said that women's scholarship throughout the Muslim history was mainly focused on the oral the oral transmission of lots of the Islamic sciences. And we talked about tafsir, we talked about hadith, and we said that a lot of the things that relate to the practical side, and what we mean by practical side, meaning the sciences that relate to people's lives and problems and qada and court and etc., was not something that a lot of the Muslim women were involved in, simply because women were pretty much away from all the dynamics of the different situations in the society that are happening, specifically the political side, and of course the criminal issues, or even when we're talking about economy and transactions and etc. And that's why with the women in fiqh was mainly focused on issues that relate to women's fiqh, women's issues, whether we're talking about women's fiqh, whether we're talking about family, divorce, talaq, hayd, the masail, the issues that relate to women's menstruation, postpartum, all those different sides that relate to women's life. That's where you would find more women discussing fiqh than actually the other issues as transactions, etc. Now, when we're looking at women in fiqh, yes, there were some women scholars in different madhahib, whether that was in madhab al-Shafi'i specifically, and you could see some of those names I mentioned here, Amatul Wahid bint al-Husayn, who memorized the Quran and qira'at, and those were some of the women that were mentioned in the book that I had mentioned before, which is أعلام النساء for Umar Rida Kahala. So Umar Rida Kahala, like I mentioned before, he pretty much added or combined all the different names, the women main figures throughout the Muslim history, and some of them are Muslim and some of them are not Muslim, but he combined all of them. And I did mention before that a lot of those women that he had mentioned that were considered from the scholars, or in those areas, in fiqh, etc., hadith, a lot of them were pretty much, you could see that there's a number that were in Egypt. There's also a number that were in Dimashq. A number of them were in Damascus, which is Damascus in Syria, and a number of them were in Egypt. And of course, Egypt, throughout Muslim history, by the way, it's really important to mention that Egypt and Damascus, or Egypt and Syria, were considered the main capitals of Islamic education, and of course Al-Andalus as well. But Al-Andalus, for 800 years, but then Dimashq and Egypt, until the time of today, are actually considered the most important capitals for Islamic education. Some of the most important figures I had mentioned, the different names by Khatun bint Ali Dimashqiya, Bayram bint Ahmad, and you could see that most of them were actually scholars in qira'at and memorized the different mutun. Now, it's really important to mention about the mutun here. What is the issue about mutun? What is a matan after all? So when we're looking at a matan, maybe I should add the word here. The matan was considered more. There are two kinds of matans. There are the kinds of matans that are pretty much they summarized that science. So let's say, for example, we're talking about all the issues that relate to fiqh al-Shafi'i. For example, it will be in one matan, meaning a summarized in just a number of pages, everything that related to that. But although it sounds like, oh, that's very simple, but the matan would many times, or most of the times, actually contain contains so many different words, so many different like it's a summary, but it contains within it everything that relates to that madhab. So every single word, every single letter actually counts. Actually counts. Now that method can be explained by scholars in 11 and 20 and even 15 volumes. So let's give an example. We can talk about one little metin, which is just in a number of pages, maybe 20, 25 pages, 30 pages. That would be the metin. And then the explanation that other scholars, like take, for example, Matn al-Khiraqi. The metin itself is just in a number of pages, but al-Mughni, in a huge, 8 huge volumes, he explained those 20 pages. Although it seems like explained it, it's not necessarily explained it, but there's a lot of details that they will actually go into. It's not necessarily just to explain, meaning what does this word mean and what does that word mean, but they will go into extensive details, and those extensive details would be in itself a new book. The other type of metin, the other type of metin is basically going to be in a type of poetry. So they will write poetry, and this poetry, just like, for example, when we're talking about al-Jazariya or al-Shatibiya, for example, you could see that the word here is Shatibiya. When we're looking at Shatibiyatain, when we're talking about Shatibiya, for example, it's like 1,000, it's 1,000 poem. And the 1,000 or 100 poem Jazari, for example, those 1,000 or 100 poems will actually contain all the science within those lines of the poem. And that's why, for example, when you're learning qira'at, most of the scholars in qira'at will not accept you to be a student in qira'at before you even memorize al-Shatibiya and al-Jazariya. And that's 110, that's a 1,000, sorry, 1,100 lines of poetry. You might say, well, why do they actually make you say that? Well, why do they actually make you memorize that? That's because those poems, those lines of the within that poetry actually summarized all the differences and the variant readings, and therefore you'll actually recognize the pattern just by memorizing the poem. So after you get an ijazah with, for example, memorizing Hafs, you will then be asked to memorize those Matn al-Jazariya and also Shatibiya before you even go into all the other qira'at. Why? Well, because they'll have all the different rules for those different scholars, but in a form of poetry that summarized everything in that science. Now, when we're looking at the question, why don't we have many female scholars? So if we had female scholars, why aren't they that many? Well, there are actually a number of different issues. Number one is that when we're talking about the challenges in acquiring ilm, the challenges in a woman's life are totally different than a man's life. Because the challenges in a woman's life, they more relate to, one, physical challenges. That includes the pregnancy, the postpartum, and of course the children, and the dynamics of, nursing and being there for the child and having that supervision for the child is not easy. Well, the second reason is traveling. The traveling was totally different than our times, where it required a lot of distant and a lot of energy to actually do that traveling. And it was very hard on a woman, not only because she didn't have a mahram, but because physically it was very daunting. It was extremely hard for a woman to keep traveling, and of course where she would probably encounter lots of dangers on the road. She might even go through different hardships, physical hardships, etc., that will be hard for her to hard for her to, manage. So it was really rare that any woman was actually going to be taking all those journeys and go through all those journeys. There were some women that did travel, and to name some of them, Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi's daughter. Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi's daughter was actually traveling with her father, but those were really few situations. Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi it wasn't just his daughter, but he was also traveling with his wife as well. So those were really, really rare instances. So Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi, take for example, Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi actually met with Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. In fact, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani stayed with Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi for almost 10 years. So he stayed with him for almost 10 years, and not only did he take ijazas from, not only did Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani take ijazas from Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi, but he even let his wife take ijazas from Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi. So and that takes us to the other point, which is that husbands can be a challenge or a support. It depends on the culture. Depends on the culture. Do all husbands actually consider that children are just a woman's responsibility, and that they should not be participating in that responsibility? This adds to a number of different cultures that did actually influence how many women were going up that education. The culture had a lot of toll on how it defined who and what is a man or a woman's duty towards helping one another, towards supporting one another, towards ilm, etc. So it was really easier for men to acquire and continue the ilm than women, because women were not always getting the support from early childhood and not always getting the support from their husbands as well. Money was also a challenge, and not an easy challenge, because when we're talking about money, if you look at some of those scholars, some of them were extensively, very rich, just like Abu Hanifa, who was actually paying for his students. He was the one that was paying for his students. In other words, he was the one that was covering his students' financial costs, even when it is relating to their own personal life. Compared to other scholars who did not even, oftentimes did not have enough money to even buy books or even support their journeys in seeking ilm. To name some of them were or Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And when he's not the only one, but you look at other, most of the scholars didn't really have the money to support their talab al-ilm. It is important to also mention that talab al-ilm, it depends. There were some governments within the Muslim countries or governments there were some governments that were covering the cost for طلاب العلم, or even the scholars. So there were some governments that were covering the costs for طلب العلم. I did not come across whether that did include women or not. I tried to look for any evidences to see if that did include women or not. I couldn't really find anything to answer that question. The other part was the self-enthusiasm. The self-enthusiasm was definitely there for men and women, but when you're looking at a woman's challenge, it was definitely going to be a lot more than a man's challenge, and a man's challenge was really based on self-enthusiasm and money. But the money and self-enthusiasm in itself was it's not that it's not hard, and it's not to say that it is easy, but definitely there are more challenges on a woman that relate to her own physical changes, her own social dynamics, and that adds on to the challenges, making it hard for a woman to get out of that area and actually excel in different sciences and to move on with the enthusiasm. When you see those challenges, it definitely does take away a lot of your focus. Myself, I must admit, there were times where, especially when my children were younger, it was extremely hard to relate with the number of different things as a mother, whether it's pregnancy, the children, taking care of the children, the supervision, nursing, all that was taking away so much of my time that it was almost hard, impossible to even hold a book, even for just an hour. And there were a number of years that I had to take away pretty much out of all that education that I was involved in, engaged in, and pretty much just focus on the children. It isn't until they grew up a little bit, and I felt that now I can take some time off and actually get the support with my husband, alhamdulillah, that I was able to get back to, going for my PhD, doing the classes, and getting back to the education that I had studied for. So when we're looking at for the sisters, I know that they're wondering, like, okay, is it always going to be that way? And the talab al-ilm, it's very important for a woman to understand that the challenges, because these challenges do come up in your lifetime, and you cannot, and unfortunately many sisters will go into a time of depression. Why did I studied so hard, maybe I shouldn't have done this, and then not realize that it's okay, that sometimes because of different changes, the pregnancy, the children, the nursing, etc., all that is taking a toll on you. It's just in the beginning, and inshallah, once you train your children how to be independent, how to do many things on their own, that's when it actually gets easier. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be as easy as it is on men, because we have to admit the social dynamics within a woman's life is definitely harder than it is and compare it to a man. The child will always feel that they're going to be connected to their mother all the time from birth, and they will feel that mom is easier to get away with than dad, so mom will be there constantly, and that does add on to the hardship. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. I mean, if we could see women that are doing this, on the secular side, is it impossible for a woman to do it in Islamic education? It's not hard, but understanding the hardship, the challenges, is actually part of learning how to accommodate and work about with them. It's very hard to understand these challenges if you did not go through them. If as a woman we could easily, if you don't have children, if you don't have children, you didn't go through this, you might underestimate what it means to live, study, and actually have children and be around that area. You will underestimate, you will think, no, I could do it. But when your body is failing on you, when your own body is taking away all the memory, when especially during morning sickness, and during that time in the pregnancy, and then the lack of sleeplessness, all that is just taking away every energy that you will have for seeking ilm, let alone for you to just wake up and just focus in where you feel like your body is failing on you. You might put a lot of effort, but then your body, and I went through this 3 times, by the way, I thought I could do it, and I fought my body, and I went against my own body, and I ended up in the emergency room 3 times, and it was just because of my body clashing on me, and I had to close so many different doors that I had been opening, just because I needed to just focus on one thing. As women, we tend to have that ability, alhamdulillah, to to do multitasking. But even when you're multitasking, sometimes you can open up so many different files in your life and not realize that those files, they're open up on their own. You just can't close them. So sometimes it's okay to take some time off until you get back on your feet in talab al-ilm. What would help, and this is really important for women, what usually helps is that, in the background, it's really important. There's the headphones that silence the noise. Sometimes to use that method of listening to the lectures, and you're listening to the lectures with your headphones and all that. But it is not easy when your children are pretty young, because they need that dialogue. They need that verbal education that you do with them. So to think that, oh, I can just put my headphones on my head and my child can play with their blocks on their own is necessarily the healthy way. It's not. Your children become the first priority, and it is extremely hard to just silence yourself and think that, oh, I'll just listen to the lecture, my child can just play with the blocks, because you have to engage all the time with your children, in teaching them, in disciplining them, in feeding them, in cleaning them. All that takes so much of your time. It is, in theory, you could put all those theories out there and say, well, I've got my planning, 10 minutes of this and 10 minutes of that, and etc. But when you deal with children, all those plans, all those theories will fall apart. This is normal. All those theories will fall apart, and all those plannings that you thought that you could do, oh, I can make this hour for teaching and that hour for feeding and that hour for this. Your child will simply break every single rule. Your child will need a diaper change right on the time that you're about to give a class. Your child will all of a sudden get gassy, and you have to be there, and they're getting colicky, they're crying, and they cannot understand. They will not understand that mom has a book to read, or something to do that is important, or a lecture to prepare. They will not understand that. And this is absolutely normal. It's just a matter of sometimes understanding that, before this happens, prepare yourself and use your time wisely before you go into this challenge. And when this challenge, gets easier, you're going to come into another challenge later on with the different, again, physical challenges. Women's bodies are very complex. And because of that complexity, it's really important to understand, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Igtanim khamsan qabla khams," that make use, or igtanim is more like ghanima is like, getting a booty in war. It's like, this is a ghanima, this is your biggest treasure. Work on those treasures, get those treasures before 5 things, and mentioned faraghika qabla shughlik, the leisure time, the free time that you have before you get busy. That's number 1. Number 2 is that your sahha, before you get ill. Women's bodies are so complex. There are going to be so many times that your body is going to get ill, not only from pregnancy or menstruation, but also, your body can fail you so many times because of all that work around you. So keep that in mind, that if you are healthy now, your health may not last long. So use your time wisely before you encounter all these different things. I know we probably, sisters, it's so easy to put this in theory, but it is extremely hard when you actually live it. And many sisters will go into depression. That's not what I learned for. What happened? And I got my degree in such and such, and right now I'm doing nothing. Or even if she attempted to do something, she'll basically lose lose in keeping her responsibilities intact with her children, with her husband, with her home. The house would be a mess if she was going to sit and study the way she used to study with the way she used to study before getting married and having children. So you're going to come across these challenges, but it's really important to keep in mind that sometimes you will come across those times where things are just looking like a mess and you can't study. But inshallah, after every single challenge, inshallah, there comes that ease. And I'm talking about this, and I'll tell you, I've got an autistic child. Alhamdulillah, I was able to know that he was autistic early, and that helped me a lot in learning how to deal with the different challenges. But if I did not know that he had this disability, I would have probably right now been still trying to figure out those challenges. Anyhow, the other thing that I would like to talk about is the issue of female scholarship, da'iya versus scholar. And this is a very sensitive topic, because right now the word da'iya and scholar is often used, and many times there's the word ustadha that is used, there's the word shaykha, and all those different terms out there, and that oftentimes those terms are different ways to run away from a number of different issues. So I'm just going to discuss a number of issues here. My mouse is failing on me. Here we go. I'm going to discuss a number of issues here, which is the issue of da'iya versus scholar. So right now, the word da'iya is more referring, which is this word right here, is more referring to what we call in al-alam al-arabi, we call them wa'adha. So a da'iya is more of a person that learned some sides of Islamic studies and uses it to promote Islamic knowledge, to promote Islamic awakening, let's call it that way, Islamic awakening, but is not necessarily qualified to answer questions that relate to fatwa and fiqh. Scholar, on the other hand, and I would like to focus on that term, because when we're talking about scholar, I think this term is very often misused, and unfortunately we have a lot of what is the word that I can use without hurting many out there. I could just say that unfortunately many times the word scholar is given to those that don't actually have the qualification to be called so. What is a scholar and what is a da'iya? When self-proclaimed, okay, there's somebody that sounds self-proclaimed. When we're looking at scholar, a scholar is supposed to actually have the first part, which is the Arabi ability to go back to the Arabi resources. And what I mean by the Arabi resources, I mean by that the fiqh resources, the tafsir resources, the ability to distinguish hadith sahih from non-authentic hadith, the ability to understand the words of the scholars, and understands also usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh, this is a very important science because it helps you distinguish the different sciences, the different tools to understand fiqh. In other words, it's the epistemological resource in order for us to understand fiqh. Now, when we're looking at these resources, not being able to go to these resources, when meaning to understand them, to distinguish aqwal al-fuqaha, to distinguish the words of the mufassirin and the lugha arabiya in it, because without lugha arabiya you're not going to be able to do tafsir. So what we're actually dealing with right now is a lot of the da'iyas out there. They're being called scholars when in reality all they did was something very similar to when somebody that's not an English speaking person, they take classes like similar to English second language learning, English as a second language, and they would take those classes. Yes, it will enable them to speak some English, or make good sound sentences, but it doesn't necessarily qualify them to be those scholars that are able to go back, distinguish a hadith sahih from a hadith da'if, or distinguish aqwal al-fuqaha, or distinguish the Arabi in the books of tafsir, etc. So many that probably took classes in places, maybe some classes, undergrad classes in probably Azhar, or undergrad classes in probably Jam'a al-Urduniya, or probably classes in Abu Nur in Syria. They took those different classes, but the teachers there themselves are not actually qualified to go back to those resources themselves. They may have taken some classes, probably, in Fiqh al-Shafi'i, in probably a book of tafsir, probably on how to go back to simple tafsir al-Sabuni, or be able to probably study al-Arba'in al-Nawawiyya, or probably studied al-Usul al-Waraqat al-Juwayni, studied some of that, some of those resources, but that does not make them qualified to go extensively and actually be scholars to speak on every single one of these sciences. That is more of an ESL compared to an ESL, as an English as a second language in our society. But unfortunately, what we're getting right now is that many will be labeled as scholars, when in reality they just took some undergrad classes in those sciences. And I've seen many times, the ijazah program, especially, that people will say, well, I've got an ijazah from this sheikh, an ijazah from that sheikh, although there are some that took an ijazah, and indeed with those ijazahs they were a lot more scholarly than other scholars with 3 and 4 and even 5 PhDs from Islamic universities. But the majority of those that took an ijazah, it was more given as a type of an honor, but it does not make the person, most of the times it is actually given as a form of honor than actually as a qualification, that person is really qualified. And this is very often that I see that somebody is named as a scholar, or she's named as a da'iyah, yet unfortunately even though she or he claimed that they had an ijazah in qira'at or Quran or etc., cannot even read the Quran, cannot even read the ayat, not even one ayah, without making major mistakes, even in the pronunciation of those words. So when we're looking at this is a tamma, this is a major issue here. If even reading the Quran, and unfortunately there's a lot of tawriya, and what tawriya means is that somebody will say, I've got an ijazah in Quran, when in reality they just have an ijazah in probably the rules of tajweed, and they will say, I've got an ijazah in Quran, or I've got an ijazah in al-madhhab al-shafi'i, when in reality they only studied probably one book in al-madhhab al-shafi'i. Or will say, I've got an ijazah in tafsir, when they only did the tafsir for juz' amma. So this is unfortunately very commonly used, and they'll unfortunately, I personally consider it problematic, because if we're getting people right now presented as scholars when in reality they only took the introductory level of Islamic sciences, and then these people are giving fatwas and even explaining major issues when we're talking about topics like Islam and feminism, Islam and postmodernism, Islam or fatwa or etc. And these people that are actually at a level of an undergrad, if not even not even an undergrad, more of an introductory level, those are the ones giving fatwa. This is going to put the ummah in a very dangerous situation. Why? Because there's that, when you are giving prescriptions and you're not qualified to give a prescription, that's going to lead into many illnesses down the road. So then you're not really healing, then you're bringing illnesses. The illnesses could be illnesses fikriya, aqidah, can be illnesses in the aqidah, can be illnesses in the da'wah, can be illnesses in Islam, can be illnesses in how we apply Islam, and so forth. So what is very common right now is that Islamic studies is more presented as a form of narrative, because a lot of the da'iyas or the scholars right now, at least the ones that are presented as scholars in the Muslim society even, a lot of them are teaching Islam as more of an interpretation, more of a thought, more of, I'll call it like more of an aqueous thing, in where it's just more of eloquent talk than actually building the basis in the ground of ulum shar'iyya, than building the ground of understanding Islam. So Islam right now, you could see that it is many times presented in a form of eloquent talk, in where it's very much into interpretation than actually going back to the qawa'id of it, then going back to the fundamentals of it, and actually going back and assigning this alim, and assigning this is the dalil, this is the asl, this is etc. And that is leading us in the situation in where people, including activists, that are right now presented as, an active Muslim on behalf of Islam. Take, for example, and I always talk about this, take, for example, Linda Sarsour. Right now, she is considered the leading figure, although not a scholar, the leading figure in leading women into what Islamic activism looks like. What is activism? What does it mean to, lead the Muslim ummah, the Muslim women, and how will Muslim women talk about their activism? And the list goes on and on when we're talking about feminism. And right now, it's not just Linda Sarsour, but we're getting different du'as as well that are right now called activists, when in reality they actually lack the foundation of Islamic scholarship. This is really dangerous. Should we stop those da'iyas? No, we shouldn't. We should not stop those da'iyas, because we need that effort. We need that effort, and somebody can be a scholar and not have the way to reach out to people's hearts and the masses. This is really important to mention, is that not because somebody is a scholar, it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to simplify that ulum shar'iyya, that Islamic knowledge, to the masses. So we actually need people that are da'iyah, even if they are at an ESL level, or let me say introductory Islamic sciences level, but it's very important that they would understand that where their qualification is where their qualification ends, meaning that you're not qualified at this, so make sure that you don't go into a ground where you're not qualified to speak in. On the other hand, for example, when we're talking about da'iyah, we need these da'iyahs, even like I said, they're introductory level Islamic sciences, because at many times they are a lot better and a lot more qualified in talking to the masses than a scholar himself. A scholar can go in lots of jargon and not be able to reach the masses, but a da'iyah at many times can simplify and bring about the ma'luma, and bring about the information in a way where it is probably easier to reach the hearts. They're able to deal with the different ways of making it what is the word, but closer to their hearts, in bringing it in a form of eloquence, or in a form where it is easily understood by the masses, which oftentimes the scholar many times cannot do, because of them speaking in such a qualified and highly qualified level, that they've been so much working in their scholastic area that they actually lost lost the ways to deal with the masses and to simplify the ma'luma, to simplify the information, and therefore they would be distant. They would be distant in speaking with the masses. All right, now the other part that I would like to say is that it's really it when we're talking about women that learn from relatives, yes, learning from different schools right now, available are online schooling, and women can actually go and learn online. Although I agree with you, it is not the same thing. It is not the same thing when you're learning online. It's not the same thing, but it is a better alternative than not learning anything. So right now we're actually getting sisters that are learning online, and mashallah doing an outstanding job because of the enthusiasm. It is available. It's easier for them to learn online and not miss out on their chores. The other part, which is when we're talking about women that learn from relatives, and this is a totally different topic than the topic that we were talking about earlier. The women that learned from relatives, we actually have a number of women that learned from relatives, and it was easier for those women to learn from relatives than actually learned through. Sorry about that. Okay. Let me go to the other topic, which is, sorry about that. I got lost on. Okay, because we covered that one. Spiritual women. I'd like to also mention, when it comes to the spiritual women, I did mention that women in fiqh and women in tafsir, etc. It's really important to talk about the spiritual women, because the in the books of in the books of A'lam al-Nisa, in the book of A'lam al-Nisa, specifically Umar Rida Kahala, he does actually mention a number of women that are more of the Sufi women than actually otherwise. And he does mention a number of women that had training in it-tazkiyah, adab it-tazkiyah, and that was what women were doing, which is called al-wa'z. So women were doing a lot of al-wa'z, and right now this is very common. And specifically, let me call out the Qubaysiyah groups. And the Qubaysiyah groups, it was a woman, although unfortunately there is a lot of articles. There are a lot of articles that are writing about Al-Qubaysiyah, and claimed that they were involved in magic and involved in all of that. I'm gonna write the name out, because I must admit there's a lot to learn from Al-Qubaysiyah. And I'm gonna Qubaysiyah groups. If you look at a lot of the articles, like I said, they're going to claim that they were related to magic, and that they had, which is all really fake. This is all real fake. Al-Qubaysiyah groups, they started out as women, and started out as women where they used to conduct the classes, the halaqas, in different women's homes. And then it started it started growing in where they took the initiative to teach Islam, specifically from al-madhhab al-Shafi'i, and later started doing more than, they were very organized, more than just madhhab al-Shafi'i, but they were also doing al-Aqidah, and there was some connection with different Sufi groups. But regardless, I think it's really important to mention that with al-Qubaysiyah, it started out teaching in the homes, and then started growing, and they started having their own schools. They started teaching the girls. Yes, they had a specific way of dressing. They had a specific way of wearing their hijab, a specific, some different things. But I think what they have done in bringing a great foundation in teaching a number of women, giving them ijazas in Al-Quran, ijazas in, I've actually met with a number of them. Although yes, sometimes those ijazas are not to the qualified level that you would expect, but there is actually a number of them that really indeed had the ilm and the qualification, and really had great and outstanding studying in Islamic studies, and actually learned great mutun. But when it comes to when it comes to the political side, then I'm not going to discuss that side, but there was a lot that involved with ilwaz. There was a lot of ilwaz in where it's teaching women how to relate to the spiritual aspect of it, which is, of course, they were related to Sufi, so that Sufi side is definitely present. And ilwaz in spiritual women is pretty much more than the scholarly women, in what I mean by al-wa'z, in where they're reminding women of tazkiyah, they're reminding women of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of, sin and what it means to pure self, do that self purification, etc. And those were a lot of the women that were actually mentioned in the books of Sufiya, Tabaqat al-Sufiya, Tabaqat, and even the different Tabaqat. And when we talk about Tabaqat, we're actually talking about the biographies of many of those women that were known for those levels. Now, when we're talking about Wav, women were doing an outstanding job in Al-Wav, but because Al-Wav is, it's more speaking in reminding spirituality and tazkiyah, that most of those women are not necessarily specialized in giving fatawa. And this is a really important issue to mention, is that they're not necessarily specialized to give fatawa, but they do a good job, and I think they're extremely needed to do that position of wa'd around the women, remind them of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they still have to, get some of that ilm as well. So some of those that were mentioned, Asma bint Musa al-Duja'i from Yemen, and of course, it wasn't just in Yemen, used to teach tafsir, hadith, reminded women about teaching, and reminded women about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and taught them manners, similarly to Al-Qubaysiyah. Now, it's really important when we're looking at the book that I was telling you about, is this book, A'lam al-Nisa, for Umar Rida Kahala, and the book, then of course, when we're talking about writings, where are women's writings? All right, women's writings were not that many. In this book, المؤلفات من النساء ومؤلفاتهن في التاريخ الإسلامي, you could see Muhammad Khair Ramadan, he worked really hard to search those names and only came across 36 female authors. Where were the rest? So is it that they didn't have the ability to write? Is it, it's really important to mention that there were some fatwa. That were given by scholars, although not necessarily the formal fatwa. And what I mean by the formal fatwa, meaning the fatwa that was embraced by the government, by the Islamic governments, not in any of those Islamic governments that is the fatwa that was embraced by the government. But there were fatwa, fair enough, it's important to say that there were fatwa that were discussing on whether it is permissible for women to learn how to write or not. Whether it's permissible for women to learn how to write or not. And some of those scholars, they considered that it was haram for women to learn how to write. They considered that it was haram for women to learn how to write. And the basis that they had based it on was that saddan lidhara'a, that women might learn how to write, and that might lead to women writing love notes or romantic notes for guys and lead to fitna. That was mentioned by some scholars, but like I said before, there was, for example, Al-Alusi, not the Alusi, the scholar of Ruh al-Ma'ani, al-Tafsir, but one of his relatives from Iraq, who actually wrote the book, and I believe I had mentioned it before, تحريم تعليم النساء الكتابة. Al-Alusi, although died in, I forgot the exact date, but almost 1,000 something, 1,100 something within that era, Hijrah, he wasn't the only one. There were, even from earlier dates, when we're talking about Ibn al-Jawzi, for example, wrote in his book Ahkam al-Nisa, and talked about that. And Ibn al-Jawzi actually died in the 5th century Hijrah, said that it was haram for women to learn how to write. And then they went into that discussion. But there were a large number of scholars that refuted this opinion and those writings and even those fatwas, and wrote extensively that this was actually not Islamic to write. So it's really important, al khair fil ummah ila yawm al qiyamah. That khair is in the ummah until Judgment Day. And it's really important to mention that, yes, there were those fatwa, but it doesn't mean that those fatwas were embraced as the general fatwa. Is it related to misogyny, etc.? Absolutely, it is. There's no doubt about that. And it is something that we have to admit that there were some things within the culture that still affected and still affect today's women's scholarship as well in Islamic studies, that still persist until the time of today, in where women are seen as not capable of studying those resources or studying those sciences, and that they're not at that level to give that ilm, and that they therefore should not be our place of focus. And there shouldn't be our place of focus. It's enough for women to do wa'z, for women to do simple wa'z, simple, that spiritual tazkiyah talk, and not really engage in the deep ulum shari'ah, whether it's in hadith or whether it's in fiqh or whether it's in tafsir. And no matter how far they went, they're not going to go far, because anyways they don't have the capacity to be at that level. Is this the misogyny within the Muslim community? I believe it is. I can't interpret it in any other way but that. But like I said, is that what Islam teaches? That isn't what Islam teaches. But just like when we say لِكُلِّ جَوَادٍ كَبْوَةٍ, and for every night, the KNIGHT, which is the warrior night, for every night he will always have some time to fall. Same thing for every single scholar. There's going to be a mistake that they will fall in, and just like for every single sword, there's going to be one day that they'll miss their target, and that's the same thing. So these things, I think, right now are changing. These things are changing within the Muslim community. We are right now seeing a number of women scholars actually come out and do an outstanding job, but still, I don't think they're at the level of the male scholars. It's not necessarily to say that there's a competition, because remember, as a Muslim ummah, we don't see that men are the competitors, but we see it as المؤمن والمؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض, that the male mu'mineen and the female mu'mineen are supporters for one another. But it's really important that وَفِي ذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ, that in that, those that want to compete, competing in giving ilm, competing in talab al-ilm, competing in jihad fi sabilillah, etc., that is actually one of those competitions that are permissible, and in fact that are encouraged in Islam. So, but is it to the point that we make it male versus female? This is what I fear, because if we're going to make it male versus female type, then we're going to probably go at a level where we're creating divisions within the Muslim ummah. We don't want that division within the Muslim ummah, because we are, at the end of the day, working in the same field towards the same shubuhat, towards the same fitan. So we have to work together. Modern female scholars. This is one of my shaykhat. She's one of my shaykhat in hadith, Dr. Maryam Saleh. She had her PhD from al-Qura in Mecca, and of course, mashallah, she got her degree in Sahih Muslim, al-Mufham min Sahih Muslim, and she did that tahqiq on it, and mashallah, she was one of the professors that taught me hadith, but it's really important to mention that she was not having all the time to actually work extensively on the sciences. So her time was really limited because she is a mother of six, and mashallah, her children, some of them, mashallah, one of them is a GI doctor in here in the US, and mashallah, all of them educated and worked hard on, making them, those educated and good akhlaq, good deen, etc. So compare her, for example, even though she's, my female shaykha, compare her with my male shuyukh. If we are to compare her with the male shuyukh, definitely she did not have the same free time that my male shuyukh were having, but she was working hard, and mashallah, she got an imtiyaz. She did get an honors in her PhD, and mashallah, did an awesome job. Now to go back to the other shaykha that you see, Saad right here. Saad, you could see she's actually a blind woman, did not get married. Saad herself was actually one of the most important scholars in Qur'at living at her time, during her time. And some of the most important scholars, and by the way, she wasn't giving that many ijazat for women. She was more giving ijazat for men than women, because she considered that women were not going to be as enthusiastic as, or even as concerned as the men would be. And in order for any woman to learn from her, she would condition that they would not get married. She did get one female student who agreed not to get married, but she ended up, that is her student, her female student. Her female student was also blind and agreed to never get married, but later she fell in love with her own student, male student, and ended up getting married, and felt, that she had betrayed her shaykha. But Saad herself was actually one of those major scholars that, why did she require that? Because she felt that marriage was going to take away woman's focus, because then she's going to get carried away, going to get busy with the children, and therefore she considered that it was going to be time wasted with a woman, teaching a woman, when all her ilm is going to be not delivered for the rest of the ummah, because she's going to be busy with her children. So that's why, I guess that's how she viewed it. There is another shaykha in Morocco, and she was really tiny. She was like almost 4'2" or 4'5", something. She was really tiny. It also had those qira'at in high sanad in al-qira'at. So we're talking about Saad. Some of the shuyukh, even Walid al-Manisi, actually got his ijazah from Saad, and you've got a number of different ulama, more than 300 and something scholars, male scholars, actually got their ijazah from Saad. And getting an ijazah from her was extremely hard, because she was one of those tough scholars, and she wasn't going to let it go just like that. If you are going to get your ijazah from her, that means she's going to be easily telling you, that's it, you're dismissed, don't have time for you, because you're not considerate enough over your studies. So it wasn't easy to get an ijazah through her. Very few women got it. It wasn't just only that woman that I had mentioned, that student of hers, but very, very few women got an ijazah from her. The other part, let's go on, when we're talking about some other shaykhat, is Shaykha Zainab Abdul Karim Zaidan. Shaykha Zainab Abdul Karim Zaidan, Dr. Iman al-Bugha. Dr. Iman al-Bugha was one of those active scholars, but unfortunately she actually went and followed ISIS, became one of the, I have no idea what happened to her right now, but I know she was one of those scholars, because her own father, Mustafa al-Bugha, was actually one of those major scholars in fiqh. And actually Iman al-Bugha herself actually comes from a family that is all scholars. that is all scholars. All of them are in fiqh, all of them are in usul, all of them are, majority of them are qada, majority of them. So she actually comes from a family that is all scholars, but later decided to join ISIS in, I can't remember if it's in Baghdad or Iraq, I can't remember, but then all the information about her just collapsed, and unfortunately she took that decision. I don't know what else happened to her later on. The other one is Dihar bint Mahmoud al-Madani. There's actually a number of different scholars, but it's really sad to mention that I had met with a number of different scholars from different Islamic universities. It's really sad to mention the reality that women scholars are not yet at the level of the male scholars in the different sciences, whether we're talking about fiqh sciences or whether we're talking about tafsir, etc. They're not at the level of the male scholars out there. I forgot to mention Aysha bint al-Shati, who was an Egyptian scholar. Maybe we'll talk about her later on. But what is the problem that female scholars are facing today? One is that many of them are unheard of due to a number of reasons. Number one, women's misogyny, masajid misogyny, and many of the women themselves are refusing to be exposed in the media. They prefer, doing their teaching in hidden corners, and I respect their opinion, but refusing to be in public and feel, many times they will say that it is akhlas, and oftentimes they will use many reasons why they don't want to be in public. And oftentimes, and I did speak to a number of female scholars out there, and I did try to encourage some of them to go out there and actually teach using media, Zoom, these different tools, and refused and felt that, we've got a number of men doing the job, so why do I have to step out there? So unfortunately, many times the women themselves, the female scholars themselves, are actually, I would say, showing themselves away from the public themselves. That's their choice. The other part is that women, when we're talking about women themselves actually choosing that, it makes it hard for many times for women to be out in those role model positions to teach women and actually be those areas to help women even answer some of those questions away probably from the male area, which may be many times it can be very uncomfortable to ask a male about issues that relate to fatwa relating women, because number one, not always do they understand what you're talking about, the different challenges, the different hardships that a woman is facing, or even the private issues. So when we're talking about a private issue relating to postpartum, to probably menstruation, to probably private issues, and many times it's extremely hard to ask a male scholar, even if you want it to be somehow, I would say, anonymous. It's still going to be it's still important for women to find women role models, to learn from them in person, and not just talk about them in, as if they were a theory than actually a reality. So having those women role models is actually very important. But keeping in mind that, yes, you may have a role model, but it's really important to remember, I studied with male shuyukh and I studied with female shuyukh, and my male shuyukh were, the majority. Yes, it is hard to deal with male shuyukh, just because the male students were having a personal relationship with those male shuyukh, so they get to deal with them on a personal level. And the women students were extremely utopian in their imagination of what it means to be religious, what it means to act upon Islam. They were very utopian in many ways. compared to the male shuyukh. And it's really sad to mention that a lot of the women that studied with me, they did marry some of the guys that were studying with me as well. And unfortunately, a large number of those marriages actually ended up in failure. And a lot of our shuyukh did mention that, the women students were very utopian in their understanding of what it means to be religious. So, and I would relate that to the women not having a close relationship with those shaykhat, in where what does it mean to be religious? What does it mean to live a normal life? It's okay to be religious and at the same time, work within your home and probably deal with the different things that you deal with in your life. So this is really common. But in the end, is that relating closely with the female shaykhat is important, but at the same time, it's really important to get the sincerity. Getting the sincerity is part of talab al-ilm. Managing time is part of getting talab al-ilm. Having the taqwa is part of getting the talab al-ilm. And now, like never in history, women have the capacity to learn online and even correspond with the scholars without needing to travel or even getting a mahram. Life has become easier for women to actually learn. But in the end, it's that it always requires that not consistency, and you have to prioritize to get ilm, and in order to get that time in place, you very much need to remember that even if you don't have a female shaykha to learn directly from, be the role model that you wish to find. You may not find the role model around you, but you be the role model that you wish to find. If you think that it is that, why don't we have female shaykhat, etc.? Well, you be the shaykha that we are looking for. You show us how to do it. I wanted to do that, but I must admit, it was harder than I thought. It was way harder than I thought. And there were many, many moments where I thought it was going to be easy as a mother, but then I discovered that, do your best, have the sincerity. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيَعْلَمْكُمُ اللَّهُ. Have the taqwa and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the ilm. Have the taqwa and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put the barakah in your time, will put the barakah in your effort. And even if you don't necessarily get to the level of being a scholar, in the end, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says, "Ughdu aliman aw muta'alliman wa la takun ath-thalithata fatahlak." What does Abdullah ibn Mas'ud say? Ughdu aliman. Be a alim. In other words, start your life with either being a alim or a student of ilm, but don't be the third, which is وَلَا تَكُنِ الثَّالِثَةَ فَتَهْلَكَ, and don't be the third one and fatahlak, and be destructed. What is الثالثة? الثالثة is basically a person that is a demagogue, a mob, that does what everybody else is doing. We'll just move on. In the end, طلب العلم is a farida. طلب العلم in itself is ibadah. طلب العلم is a ibadah, regardless of whether people knew about you, whether, there are so many scholars out there, and some of the best scholars, that we only knew about them not through the media, but we knew about them through their books. We knew about them through the ilm that they had delivered, and that this is more important. This is more important. What is going to last after your death is more important than, I want people to give me a microphone for me to speak in public and be known and all the spotlight. Unfortunately, right now we're seeing ICNA and ISNA and those different platforms. They're just inviting women for the sake of inviting women, just to appear. Just to appear that they're inviting women and that they're inclusive, etc. When in reality, a lot of those women are really not qualified. They're really not qualified. It's just that ICNA, ISNA, all those areas, they just wanted to say, hey, we're being inclusive. We're not here, marginalizing women. Here we are, we're inviting women to speak, etc. Say what is haqq and don't say what is batil. If you can't say what is haqq, don't say what's batil. And in the end is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for the effort that you put in, and not necessarily whether you have reached your destination or not. Put the effort, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for it, and put the sincerity in, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put the barakah in it and bless that work, inshallah. And Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, and inshallah we'll be able to answer the questions if there are any questions. I'd be happy to unmute if somebody wants to say it in person. Today is our last day for the evolution of Muslim thinking. So inshallah, we'll be talking about other upcoming classes, inshallah. So stay tuned, inshallah. If you want to suggest a specific class, go ahead. I was thinking of akhlaq in Islam, but I won't be able to start that right now because I'm homeschooling my children. I'll be starting it later on, inshallah, down the road. So if anybody wants to ask a question or suggest something or say anything, I'd be happy to unmute or even listen. Go ahead, Fatmata.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykha.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So, ISNA, the people, personally, I thought were very much respected for what they do. Based on what you're saying, and the females that they do call to the event just to have female representation, why do you think they're really underrepresenting the female scholars, but just women to represent, just to say that they've covered that part of it?
Well, here's one thing. When I actually talked to some of those organizers, and I said, why are you inviting people like, for example, Linda Sarsour, who does not whatsoever have any Islamic qualification to speak on behalf of Muslim women. And when she presents herself, I as a Muslim woman, and I speak as if she's speaking on behalf of the Muslim community. What their response was is that, we're here inviting the masses, and so we just have to invite people that will bring in more and more audience. And unfortunately, I'm against that, because all you're doing is, according to the masses, is that you are presenting a woman or presenting a person. It doesn't just have to be Linda Sarsour, but this is just an example. But what it means is that you are here when the scholars are present, and ICNA presenting, or ISNA presenting themselves as an Islamic institution. It is somehow confirming or telling the public and telling the Muslim masses that this person is somebody that we had approved, that their type of activism, or at least the way that they do things, and this is really dangerous, because if we're going to be in the midst of a number of scholars being present and being silent about a lot of the different things that are being said, and they're being presented like these great Muslim women activists, these role models, etc., this can actually be a deluding thing for the many Muslim women. And we're seeing a number of Muslim women organizations right now rising, and considering that, hey, ISNA did it, so therefore we should do it too. This is a Muslim women figure, and trying to find any Muslim women figure. Just because she's wearing a hijab, it doesn't make her qualified to speak on behalf of Islam. And just because she took some, probably, I'm not talking about Linda Sarsour, but certain figures, they took some scholarly, probably, ijaza, or had some certain things. the scholar, even if she is a scholar, even if she has a PhD in Islamic sciences, whether it's usul fiqh, etc., that does not make her, or even if it's al-Qardawi himself, not because they are saying an opinion, it doesn't make their opinion an Islamic opinion just because they said it. It is considered an Islamic opinion based on the evidences that supports that particular opinion. So when we talk about an Islamic opinion or an Islamic figure, these are two different things. And a Muslim figure is right now for the masses seen and perceived as the person that resembles Islamic activism and what Islamic activism should look like. Unfortunately, right now, I personally consider to invite such figures is extremely dangerous, because the youth will only understand that this is somebody I should replicate. This is a person I should imitate. This is a person that is put at a pedestal. This person, look, all these scholars are right now praising, so therefore this is telling me that this is acceptable in Islam. And this is extremely dangerous, because what we're seeing right now is a new type of Islam, progressive Islam, that is pro-feminism, that is pro-abortion, that is pro-LGBT, that is right now even, pro-liberalism, all that. And it's a muhajjaba that's talking. It's a woman that's wearing hijab that is, probably at an illicit magazine, but hey, we're so happy, at least, she made it into a very famous magazine. For another person, look, she's Somali, she's, her name is Eden, I forgot what her name was, and look, she's actually wearing a hijab, and she is, and she's a fashion, what do they call those girls that walk, and those role model women, what, I forgot what they call them. And the same thing. So when we're actually considering that, look, she's a hijabi, and she's also a Lady Gaga, she's a hijabi, and look, she can sing, and she's a hijabi, and look, she's actually on a magazine in where she's giving a different pose, but at least, hey, here's what's presented. So I think it's really important to put those words out there, that this is deluding the masses. This is deluding the masses. And this is really dangerous. I hope I explained it. Another question says, what kind of advice do you give for those who are young but don't know from who they shall study? I think it's really important to, when we're talking about where to study from, go to those Islamic institutions. The Islamic institutions, whether we're talking, in number one, learn from Muslim scholars. Never think that a non-Muslim is going to be whatsoever qualified, or in Islam, and even if that was Harvard, those institutions do not teach Islam, they teach about Islam. They probably Islamic civilization, some taste of fiqh, etc. But to learn fiqh, you have to actually learn it from studying under the scholars that are Muslim fiqh scholars. So we're seeing right now institutions that are claiming that they are Islamic institutions, but actually got their degrees probably Cambridge, probably Oxford, probably Harvard, etc. But that does not, or probably Chicago University, but that does not qualify the person to actually be the scholar, to give the fatwa, or to even be considered a scholar in Islamic studies. For you to get a degree in Islamic studies, I would highly recommend that number one is that you first go through an institution to learn the Arabic language first, and then go through studying through an Islamic institution to study Islamic studies. If you can't, and you feel, well, I just need to learn at least the basics, then I will say, well, go through an Islamic institution that teaches Islamic studies in English, but that is only considered an introductory level in Islamic sciences. Somebody that learned Islamic sciences in English no matter what degree they got, they can go for a PhD. That is nothing but an introductory level of Islamic sciences, even if they got a PhD. Even if they got a PhD in Islamic sciences, it's called an introductory level in Islamic sciences. Islamic sciences are actually learned through the main resources by going deep in Lugha Arabiya, by going deep in those books of fiqh, books of tafsir, books of nahu, books of usul. That's how you learn Islamic sciences in order to be a scholar. But if you don't have the time, you don't have etc., that doesn't mean that if you can't get to that level, at least get to learning the basics of your deen, even if it is through an Islamic institution. And I mean by Islamic institution, right now we are getting a number of different so-called Islamic institutions that are teaching Islam, but in reality they're actually teaching progressive Islam. The type of progressive Islam is right now heavily funded. It is heavily funded because institutions like RAND and different think tanks are right now funding those institutions, the so-called Islamic universities, but in reality they are progressive Islam, in where it is right now giving degrees in Islamic studies in order to be an alternative to the other institutions that are teaching Islamic sciences, because according to Rand and Cheryl Bernard, that they needed to find an alternative to the fundamentalist Islam, that's what they called it, fundamentalist Islam, by promoting and funding the progressive type of Islam that is friendly and that is friendly with the liberal Western culture, and therefore easily to compromise with the liberal postmodern lifestyle. So people like Khalid Abul Fadl is right now definitely going to be funded and his ideas promoted. In fact, even Cheryl Bernard said, hey, we need to promote these types of people. And those ideas, and it's really out there right now that we're getting lots of institutions that are going to be funded by those think tanks as a way to empty the Muslims from Islam, which they regard as a threat. At least those think tanks regard as a threat. So to empty Islam from the Muslims by making another type of Islam that is friendly with the postmodern lifestyle that is right now on the rise. Whether we're discussing probably LGBT issues, evolution, what else, atheism lifestyle, hijab, that it's just a choice, and all those different things. And unfortunately right now this is becoming something that a lot of the dua are being pressured to also accept. Somebody's asking, Mishka University, Islamic Online University is basic beginning. I'm proud to be a fundamentalist. This is not me saying, this is Lula saying. All right. Mishka University, I think, is doing an outstanding job, and Islamic Online University. There's also the Islamic University of Minnesota. I think they're also doing an outstanding job. I know that there's I think Taiba, Medina, I forgot what they were called, but definitely learn from Islamic institutions. Be careful from the progressive type of Islam, of the progressive type of, they call themselves Islamic institutions, but they are not. They're very far away. And نسأل الله العافية and نسأل الله الثبات. And جزاكم الله خيرا everyone. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I know that there are going to be many people probably offended by today's lecture, but I think it's really important to say what is haqq, and at least what I believe is haqq. And alhamdulillah that we have right now, our own platform. And even if other platforms may not like what you say, in the end is that you just have to say what is haqq, and don't say what is batil if you cannot say what is haqq. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and jazakumullah khairan everyone. Assalamu alaikum.